Outside the impressive St George's Hall in Liverpool is an equally impressive statue. It depicts a Victorian soldier advancing sword in hand, an image of a bygone age. On closer inspection, you can read that this soldier is a son of Liverpool, Major General William Earle. Not exactly a household name nowadays. And then you'll read that he was killed at the Battle of Kirbekan in Sudan. Now, if you haven't heard of General Earle, I reckon there's an even stronger chance you haven't heard of the Battle of Kirbekan. It's a forgotten battle, a footnote in the British wars against Mahdist Sudan in the 1880s, part of Britain's quest to rescue Charles Gordon, who was besieged in Khartoum. A battle that involved a cunning deception, a heroic bayonet charge by a Highland regiment, and the death of 3 senior officers. It was a British victory, but in the end, a pointless one. But maybe it's time to shine a light on this battle and the general from Liverpool who fought it. Welcome to the story of the Scouse General William Earle and his victory over the Mahdists at the Battle of Kirbekan in 1885. For those of you who've been following my talks on the British-Sudanese wars during the 1880s, you will know a lot of the background to the events, so I don't want to repeat all that information all over again. However, let me, especially for those of you who are new to the History Chap, just put this battle into context. Following a revolt against their rule in the Sudan, led by the self-proclaimed Mahdi, the Egyptians appealed to the British for support. Army General and darling of the British public, Charles Gordon, was sent to Khartoum in 1884 to organise an evacuation of the Sudanese capital. Gordon decided that rather than evacuate the city, he would defend it against the Mahdi, and ended up besieged. The British government now came under pressure from the press and the public to rescue their hero. Hence a British military expedition was established under the command of General Sir Garnet Wolseley. He determined to advance up the River Nile to rescue Gordon in Khartoum. Now, I've done a talk about this Nile expedition and will post a link in the description below. At the same time, another expedition under General Graham was sent to the Red Sea coastal area of Sudan to initially rescue some besieged Egyptian garrisons and then to try and establish an alternative route to Khartoum. Again, I've produced 3 talks about those events, the battles of El Teb and Tamai and the second Suakin expedition, and links are in the description below. So let's pick up the story of General William Earle. The progress of the British rescue effort up the Nile was painfully slow, not least because Wolseley was waiting on Canadian boatmen to join him, and because the British government were loath to commit troops into a potential 19th century equivalent of the Vietnam War. Finally, by the 28th of December 1884, the British Army had reached the town of Koti on the Nile. As the crow flies, this is about 160 miles from Khartoum. Unfortunately, Wolseley's plan was to follow the Nile all the way. However, the river doesn't flow directly down from Khartoum to Koti. Instead, it heads north before turning back on itself almost like a sickle, with the handle at the capital and the tip of the crescent-shaped blade at Koti. It would add hundreds of miles to the relief journey. And it was now that Wolseley received a message from Gordon in Khartoum warning that food was running low and he couldn't hold out much longer. Spurred into action, Wolseley split his force. A principally mounted army, the Desert Column under Major General Sir Herbert Stewart, would take a short cut across the desert to arrive much further up the Nile. Meanwhile, the rest of the army, under Major General Earle, would continue to proceed up the river to join him. William Earle was born in Hope Street, Liverpool in 1833, the son of a wealthy merchant by the cracking name of Hardman Earle. Despite pressure from Hardman for his son to join the family business, young William decided he wanted to be a soldier. He was commissioned in the 49th Foot Regiment, which later became the 1st Battalion of the Berkshire Regiment, in 1851. Like many officers of his generation, William Earle saw active service in the Crimean War, fighting at the battles of Alma, Inkerman, and in the siege at Sebastopol. Mentioned in dispatches, he was promoted to the rank of captain, and in the late 1850s transferred to the Grenadier Guards. He served in a variety of posts and positions, including military secretary to the Viceroy of India, before being promoted to the rank of Major General in 1880. Shortly afterwards, he joined Sir Garnet Wolseley on the Egyptian expedition to tackle the revolt by Urabi Pasha. Following the victory at Tel el Kebir, Earle was placed in command of the British garrison at Alexandria. So, by the time the British government decided to finally rescue Charles Gordon, they were fortunate enough to have a competent senior officer on the ground in Egypt. Indeed, the High Command initially considered placing William Earle in charge of the entire relief effort. Instead, that role went to Britain's hero of the hour, whom the press dubbed our only general, Sir Garnet Wolseley. Nevertheless, Wolseley had a high enough opinion of Earle to give him the command of the Nile column, which was impressive, as the Liverpudlian also had the support of Wolsey's arch enemy in the army, the Duke of Cambridge. Whilst William Earle and his column made their way up the Nile, the Desert Column were in action. Their lightning dash across the desert was not as fast as anticipated due to a lack of camels, but had been spotted by the Mahdi. Hence, it ran straight in to a waiting Sudanese army at Abu Klea. Despite victories both at Abu Klea and the following day at Abu Klea, the British sustained considerable casualties, not least Sir Herbert Stewart, who died from his wounds. Now, I've covered both of those battles in other stories, and again I'll post links in the description. Meanwhile, Earle was working his way up the Nile. It was a slow journey, not least because they had to haul their boats through the rapids at the Fourth Cataract. This involved days of excruciating effort as the soldiers and Egyptian levies hauled boats through the fast-flowing waters whilst negotiating slippery rocks, the heat, and always mindful of a possible ambush. At times, they were only able to cover 3 miles a day. The leading parties of the column would have to halt at midday and spend the afternoon making a defensible camp for the night. And meanwhile, the long column would slowly join them, the tail enders only arriving as darkness fell. It was on this slow journey that they heard the news of the 2 battles fought by the Desert Column. The men of the River Column were envious. However, the considerable casualties in those battles, especially amongst the officers, had a sobering effect on the men of the Nile Column, who had yet to meet the Mahdists in battle. But worse news was to come, or at least for General Earle. On the 4th of February, he received news from Wolseley that Khartoum had fallen. The fate of Charles Gordon was, at this time, unknown. Earle, who was ordered to keep this news from the men, paused and waited for further instructions. Meanwhile, the men in the column were blissfully unaware of events in the Sudanese capital. In fact, they were more concerned with a rumour that was rushing around the camp that the naval brigade had raced to the city from Suakin on the Red Sea coast and had lifted the siege. On the 7th of February, Earle was ordered to continue his advance to join up with the Desert Column further up the Nile. He was also ordered to still withhold news of the fall of Khartoum from his men. There was no point, Wolseley argued, lowering morale when they might still be required to storm the city and rescue Gordon, who could be a prisoner of the Mahdi for all they knew. On the 9th of February, the advance force of the Nile column came alongside Dukla Island, and there General Earle found his way blocked by a strong Mahdist army arranged on 3 hills in front of him. Whilst the 2 forces were comparable in numbers, the British were about 1,000 strong, the Mahdists were about 1,500, the Sudanese on the hills were armed with Remington rifles and had the high ground in their favour. Any attempt to storm their position would be costly to the British. Not knowing whether the Mahdists would hold that defensive position or launch one of their full frontal attacks, as had been experienced by the Desert Column at Abu Klea, General Earle ordered a zareba, or makeshift fortification, to be constructed from rocks and thorn bushes. Once completed, he positioned his infantry units inside. At the same time, he ordered the 19th Hussars and units from the Egyptian Camel Corps forward to ascertain both the exact Sudanese positions and the possibilities for a British attack. Almost immediately, a large force of Mahdists descended from their hilltops towards them, and the Hussars and Egyptian Camel Corps beat a hasty retreat back to the zareba. That night, which was a particularly dark one, the British camp stood to, waiting for the inevitable Sudanese attack. It didn't materialise. The Mahdist commander was content to hold the high ground and force Earle to take casualties trying to dislodge him. The next morning, 10th of February 1885, Earle decided to attack. As the Mahdists looked down, they saw dust rising from the British zareba, and then 2 companies of the South Staffordshire Regiment in their red tunics come into view. Accompanied by 2 guns from the Egyptian artillery, they moved into a position midway between the hills and the Zariba, facing the Sudanese. At 8 a.m, the guns opened fire. As the Mahdists took cover from the incoming shells, they launched a rapid rifle fire against the British position below. The South Staffordshires fired back in return. But in their preoccupation to deal with the British attack, the Mahdists had not spotted what General Earle was up to with the rest of his troops. At this moment, he was leading 6 further companies of the South Staffs and 6 companies of the Black Watch through the rough ground away from the river to the left of the Mahdist positions and into a dried up watercourse. The men were all wearing their red tunics, and deliberately so. Earle believed that the British redcoat would add a psychological advantage to his impending attack. Despite their lack of camouflage uniform, the dried watercourse was so deep that his men were completely shielded as they moved behind the hills. It took the British almost an hour to get into position, but when they did so, they had, unbeknown to the Sudanese, surrounded their enemy. Once in position, General Earle ordered his infantry out of the dried-up watercourse. Dressed in their red tunics, they were immediately spotted. Suddenly, the Mahdists switched their positions from facing the Zariba to facing their rear. Hundreds of Remington rifles now fired on the British, who were slowly advancing up the rocky, broken ground. As the gradient and the Mahdist rate of fire increased, Earle realised that he couldn't dislodge the defenders with British rifle fire alone. He ordered the Black Watch to fix bayonets and charge. With the skirl of the bagpipes, the kilted Highlanders let out a war cry and advanced. Cresting the summit of one of the hills, they now engaged in a fierce hand-to-hand combat before driving the Sudanese back. Having captured the most elevated hill, they now proceeded to fire on the Mahdist troops who were still holding off the South Staffordshires. Slowly, the Mahdist position started to crumble, and now it was the turn of 2 companies of the South Staffordshires to charge. Cresting the summit of their hill, they were joined by the rest of their battalion in a vicious tussle with the defenders. Caught from behind, the Mahdists were trapped. They had 2 options: surrender or fight. They chose to fight. But with the British numbers on the hilltops increasing, and combined with their disciplined volley fire, the Mahdists were cut to pieces. But still they fought on, refusing to surrender. The only Mahdists who escaped the bloodbath were those who ran down to the riverbank and jumped into the Nile. And even then, they had to dodge the bullets from the British on the high ground above. Whilst the battle for the hills was taking place, the 19th Hussars under Colonel Butler rode 3 miles upriver and attacked the Mahdist camp. Now somewhat denuded, because most of the occupants were up on the hills, they were able to sweep in and capture 10 enemy battle standards or battle flags. The pretty much forgotten Battle of Kirbekan was the only battle that the river column fought against the Mahdists in this Nile expedition. It had lasted 5 hours, and it had been a costly affair. Of the Mahdist force positioned on the hills that morning, somewhere around 1,000 now lay dead, including their commander. The British had lost 12 men killed and 52 wounded. Sometimes with stories of debacles from the Crimean War, the Zulu War, the Boer War and others, it's easy to assume that the British Army in the 19th century was led by a bunch of duffer officers. Now, intellectually and strategically that was sometimes the case, but there was never any doubting their bravery. In almost any of the little wars fought by Queen Victoria's armies, the casualty ratio amongst British Army officers was incredibly high. The Battle of Kirbekan is a case in point. Of the 12 British dead, 3 were officers, and not low-ranking ones. Lieutenant Colonel Eyre, the commanding officer of the South Staffordshires, had been killed leading his men forward. In his 50s, Eyre had joined the regiment, then called the 38th Foot, as a private. Fighting in the Crimean War, within 4 years he'd been commissioned. Also dead was Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Robert Coveney of the Black Watch. Coveney's an interesting character. In his 30s, he came from a prominent merchant family in Sydney, Australia. Rather than joining the family merchant business, he, just like William Earle, had opted to join the British Army. He'd fought both in the Ashanti War and at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir in Egypt, where he'd been mentioned in dispatches by General Wolseley himself. At the time of the Battle of Kirbekan, he had been promoted from captain to brevet lieutenant colonel. And speaking of sons of wealthy merchants who had joined the army instead of the family business, Major General William Earle from Liverpool was the most high-profile casualty of this forgotten battle. Having given the order for the Black Watch to charge, he had personally led their assault before being hit by a Mahdist bullet. All 3 dead officers were buried by the River Nile. But Major General William Earle was not forgotten in his home city. A fine statue of the general advancing into battle was erected outside St George's Hall in the city centre. It's still there today, although many folk probably don't know who he is or his story. Maybe this talk will help just a little bit. Command of the bloodied but victorious River Column now passed to Eyre's deputy and member of Wolseley's Ashanti Ring, Colonel Brackenbury. He continued the march up the Nile towards Abu Hamed, from where the river started to turn south towards Khartoum. But events were now moving faster than the Nile at the rapids at the Fourth Cataract. With the now confirmed death of Charles Gordon in Khartoum, the Nile expedition was in disarray. Exactly what was its purpose anymore? In London, Prime Minister Gladstone, reacting to intense political and royal pressure, ordered General Wolseley to continue the advance on Khartoum to teach the Mahdi a lesson. Wolseley, who hitherto had been keen to advance to save Gordon at all costs, now reconsidered the situation. There was no imperative to save the dead Gordon, and the Sudanese summer was about to arrive. He advocated regrouping and advancing later in the year. And hence, he ordered Brackenbury to turn around and head back down the river. Shortly after the Nile column had arrived all the way back at Koti, the Desert column under Redford's Buller staggered in, also having been ordered to retreat. Morale in the camp at Koti was sinking. As Private Robertson from the Black Watch wrote, "I don't see what benefit is to be derived from this country. We all wish they would withdraw from it altogether." Within weeks, Private Robertson's desire was met. Events far away in Afghanistan threatened to erupt into a full-scale war between Great Britain and Russia. Sudan and revenge for Gordon now no longer seemed that important. Wolseley was ordered to wind up his operation. The Nile column retreated back into Egypt. The Suakin expedition under General Graham sailed away from Sudan. The threatened war with Russia failed to materialise, but Sudan had now lost its appeal. For the time being, Britain's policy with Sudan would be to prevent the Mahdists exporting their form of jihad into Egypt, threatening Britain's interests in the Suez Canal, and to rescue any anti-Mahdist leaders still stuck in the country, in particular the governor of the very southern province of Equatoria, Emin Pasha. Sudan would take a low profile for the next decade, but there would still be some more battles. Join me next time as the British-led Egyptian army finally shows that after the debacles at Shekan and the First Battle of El Teb, they can take on the Mahdist warriors. It's time for the battles of Suakin and Toski. And in a moment, you'll see a link to my talk on the Battle of Guinness, where the remnants of the Nile column fight off the Mahdists. It was the last time the British Army went into action in their red tunics. There's also a link to my supporters club, where you can get access to exclusive members-only talks, monthly live quizzes, and chats with me. Thanks for joining me today, and until next time, keep well, and I look forward to joining you again very soon.